There's at least one daughter in this family who didn't turn out to be an embarrassment. My mother said it with her arm wrapped around my younger sister, the marketing director, the one whose engagement photos took up half the mantle, and then she let her eyes drift over to me. Not a glance. A sentence with a period already typed at the end of it. The kind of look you give a stain you've already decided isn't coming out. 19 people went quiet at that backyard cookout in Asheville. 19 sets of eyes swung toward the woman in the worn government-issue field jacket standing near the cooler, holding a can of root beer she hadn't opened. My mother let the silence stretch, then pushed the knife in slow. 38 years old, no husband, no real career, playing soldier on the taxpayer's dime while your sister's about to make partner. Bet they let you wear a little uniform and feel important, don't they, sweetheart? 19 people laughed. Not a polite cough of a laugh. A full release, the kind that only happens when the person in charge throws the first stone and everyone else feels permission settle over them like a blanket. I didn't flinch, didn't raise my voice. I looked straight through my mother's contoured cheekbones, through 38 years of her deciding I was the disappointment before I'd even finished growing into my own face, and I said one word. Reaper. A beer bottle slipped out of someone's hand and shattered on the patio stones behind me. At the folding table by the grill, a man named Earl, no, that name's taken, I won't use it. A retired combat medic, 61 years old, forearms like braided rope, a man who'd pulled bodies out of burning vehicles in Kandahar without his hands shaking once, had gone the color of drywall. His sweet tea slid right out of his fingers like his hand had forgotten how to close. Stop laughing, he said. His voice came out like it had been dragged over gravel. Dear God, that's Reaper. Then, in front of my mother, in front of all 19 relatives who'd just been howling along with her, this gray-haired man stood up straight as a flagpole, heels together, and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. The laughter died standing up. But before I tell you why a man who'd seen things most people pray, they never have to imagine, was shaking at the sight of me, and why my mother paid for every year of that contempt in one single evening, hit the like button and subscribe, because what happened in the next 10 minutes, nobody at that cookout saw coming. The medic, I'll call him by his army nickname, Doc, lowered his hand and turned to my mother. No deference left in his face. None of the courtesy a guest is supposed to extend to the woman whose deviled eggs he'd just been eating. He reached into his flannel shirt's breast pocket and pulled out a folded manila envelope, soft at the creases, taped twice where it had clearly been opened and closed more times than paper is built for. He laid it flat on the picnic table and spread out 14 newspaper clippings, arranged by date, every one of them scrubbed clean by military censors. No name, no photograph, nothing that would point straight at me. But Doc had circled details in red pen on every single one. Unit designations, aircraft tail numbers, deployment regions. Connect those dots and there was only one person they could be pointing at. Every time one of these ran, even half a paragraph, he said, voice still raw, I cut it out. People like her never brag about what they did, ever. The laughter hadn't fully died yet. It had frozen mid-breath, the way a held note does right before it cracks. 19 people stood in my Aunt Pam's backyard knowing less about their own blood relative than a stranger holding a yellowed envelope did. I didn't say anything. I picked up my root beer, set it back down on the same ring of condensation it had already left on the wood, and let my eyes move slow across the yard, the way you scan a room before you decide if it's safe to relax in it. Who was inching toward the gate? Who was waiting for me to lose it so they could call me unstable later over coffee? Who was glancing at my mother, waiting for the cue on how to react? My uncle, the loudest logger of the bunch, was suddenly very interested in his own sneakers. My sister had her phone out, thumb hovering over the screen like she wanted to text someone but couldn't decide who. My mother recovered first. She always did. Her voice dropped into that syrupy, patient register she used when she wanted to sound like she was being the reasonable one. Doc, I appreciate the gesture, I really do, but Quinn has always had a tendency to exaggerate her role in things. Even as a kid, she lived in her own little world. A ripple of laughter, smaller this time, nervous, relieved that someone had diffused it. My sister chimed in right on cue, eyebrows knit with manufactured concern. Are you okay though? You seem really tense. Is everything all right with you lately? The question was a scalpel. It repositioned me in one sentence from somebody who just earned a salute to somebody who needed a wellness check. Not a hero. A patient. They didn't argue with Doc directly. They just made everyone wonder if I was the kind of person whose word you could trust. I set my can down, breathed in for 4 counts, held for 4, out for 4. I stood, walked over to Doc, and shook his hand, short and firm, looking him dead in the eye. Thank you for being here, Sergeant Whitfield. Just enough to let him know I'd recognized his rank the second I saw him. I'd always known who he was, the second he walked through Aunt Pam's gate 2 hours earlier. He leaned in close, voice dropping below the noise of the party. Voss, he murmured. General Roland Voss. He's getting an award tomorrow night in Charlotte. Some leadership honor, funded by donations from the families of the men he left behind. One beat of silence. I nodded once. The campaign had started. I didn't go inside the house after the cookout wrapped up. I sat in my old Chevy pickup, parked along the curb in front of my mother's place, engine off, windows down, hands resting on the wheel at 10 and 2 out of pure muscle memory. When I reached back to fold a lawn chair into the bed, my hand brushed against a purse my mother had left on the passenger seat by mistake. Inside, wallet, a tube of lipstick, and a family photo from the year I turned 16. My mother stood center frame, one arm looped around my sister's shoulders, 12 relatives clustered tight around the two of them, like they were the only flowers worth photographing. I was off on the far edge, no hand on my shoulder, body angled slightly away, not because I'd chosen to stand apart, but because that was the space left over, once everyone else had already claimed the good real estate around the people who mattered. I looked at my own 16-year-old eyes in that photo. Not sad, not angry, flat. The expression of a kid who'd already figured out that being the one nobody reached for wasn't an accident. It was just the climate she lived in. The memories didn't come back in order. They came in pieces, sharp ones. The year I got accepted into the academy program, my mother didn't ask for the date of the ceremony, didn't write it on the calendar hanging in her kitchen, didn't mention it to a single relative. The year my sister got promoted to assistant manager at the dealership where she sold cars, my mother booked a private room at a steakhouse 2 weeks out, picked the menu herself, called every cousin in 3 states. The year I mailed home my first commendation ribbon from overseas, she dropped the little box in a junk drawer without opening it. A piece of ribbon, she'd said later, like that explained something. The year my sister leased a new SUV, my mother posted a photo on Facebook, captioned my daughter, "So proud of you." Not once, not by accident. This was a system she ran with the precision of a metronome, never missing a beat across 2 decades. My sister got seen, I got tolerated. The sharpest memory of all, I was 19, standing in our kitchen in Hendersonville, telling my mother I'd been accepted to fly status, that I was shipping out for flight school. She didn't get angry. She got sorry for me, voice gentle, almost sweet, like she was breaking bad medical news. "Oh honey, kids who don't have other options join the military," not an accusation. A verdict already filed. You failed at everything else, so you're enlisting. My sister, sitting at the counter painting her nails, didn't even look up. She never had to lift a finger. My mother held the blade. My sister just kept the door open for her. That was the moment I understood, with total clarity, that my mother hadn't just doubted me. She decided, long before I was old enough to prove her wrong about anything, that this particular daughter had nothing worth betting on. And that decision never got revised. Not once in 38 years, I slid the photo into the glove compartment, didn't toss it, kept it the way you keep evidence you might need to produce later. Fall of 2014, 3 in the morning. A sandstorm rolling in hard from the west, visibility at 0, the kind of dark where you genuinely can't tell if your own eyes are open. 7 Marines pinned down in an ambush corridor, 2 already wounded badly enough that the radio chatter had that particular flat calm men get when they're trying very hard not to sound as scared as they are. Command came through clean and final. All air assets returned to base immediately. And underneath that order, a voice I would carry in my skull for the rest of my life. General Roland Voss, calm as a man ordering a sandwich. Cut losses, all assets, RTB final. I was strapped into the cockpit of a CH-47 when the last distress call cut through the static. A voice too young for the situation it was in. Lance Corporal Caleb, no, can't use that. I'll just call him the boy. 20 years old, first deployment, first real firefight, first time learning that the word backup sometimes means nothing at all. He didn't scream. He said 4 words, small and clear, like a kid asking to be carried up the stairs. "Somebody, please, hurry." My co-pilot looked at me. A kid named Reyes, 23, 3 weeks from rotating home to a wife and a baby girl he'd only ever seen in photographs. I watched the exact second he understood we were going anyway. He didn't argue. He cinched his harness 1 notch tighter and said 2 words. "Your bird." That's what trust looks like once the regulations have been stripped away and all that's left is whether the person beside you believes you'll bring them home. I hit the ignition sequence and flew straight into the wall of sand. The aircraft took its first hit 90 seconds in. Warning lights strobing red across the panel in a pattern I still see sometimes behind my eyelids. I cut the audio because I needed the sound of my own rotors more than I needed a machine screaming at me that I was about to die. Blind landing on a surface that felt like another planet, navigating by compass heading and the feel of the cyclic under my palm. When the cargo door slid open, the first body hauled aboard was the boy, unconscious, lighter than I'd braced for. His fingers, ice cold, were still locked around my collar in the last reflex of a man going under. I didn't pry them loose. We took a second hit on the climb out. The frame shuddered hard enough to rattle my teeth in my skull. I still didn't let go. 5 came home that night. 2 didn't make it, but the boy did. That was the only math that mattered to me. General Voss had connections that reached 3 pay grades above his own, and a survival instinct that outweighed his conscience by a margin he'd clearly never bothered to calculate. Within 72 hours of touchdown, charges landed on a desk with my name on it, pre-written almost: insubordination, reckless endangerment of an operation, disregard for command authority. Every word built to make it sound like I was the danger, not the storm, not the ambush, not the man who'd ordered 7 lives signed away from a climate-controlled command tent. Newspapers got tips from anonymous sources wearing stars on their shoulders. The headline practically wrote itself. Rogue pilot defies direct orders, risks entire operation for personal glory. Nobody printed the part where 5 men walked off that aircraft alive. Nobody called Reyes to ask what actually happened in that cockpit. I called home. The only time in my whole life I cried to my mother on the phone. Not as an officer, not as a pilot. As a daughter, sitting on the edge of a cot in a barracks 5,000 miles from anyone obligated to love her, hoping to hear 3 words: I believe you. She let me get all the way through it: the storm, the boy, the charges, the headlines, General Voss's name. She didn't interrupt once, and for one fragile second I actually thought, maybe this is the thing that finally cracks something open in her. Maybe hearing your own kid's voice break is the sound that overrides everything else. She waited until the last sob quieted down. Then she said, voice flat, almost bored, I told you so. The military was never for people with real prospects. Then she hung up, no goodbye, just the dead mechanical tone where her voice had been a half-second earlier. 2 days after that, my husband called, not to ask if I was okay, not to ask what really happened out there. He wanted my updated mailing address so he could send the divorce papers. He'd read the headline before he'd thought to dial his own wife's number. The only person who held the line for me was a 2-star named General Marcus Voss. Different Voss, no relation, life has a sense of humor sometimes, who quietly transferred me into classified operations and scrubbed my name from every database the other Voss could access. A cover title, Administrative Liaison Officer, 3 words built to make me invisible to anyone hunting for a pilot. He told me, standing in a windowless room at the Pentagon, door locked, voice steady as a metronome, you don't need to be cleared today. You need to survive long enough to be cleared later. And when that day comes, I'll be standing right there. That's not a favor between friends. That's an order. Are we clear? Yes, sir, I said. Good, he said. Now go be invisible and be excellent at it. 10 years passed since that storm. 10 years, and my mother never once, not on a phone call, not in a card, not at a single Thanksgiving, asked how I'd survived any of it. Not the sandstorm, not the charges, not the divorce papers that showed up 2 weeks later in a manila folder with a yellow sticky note. But Doc kept his clippings. General Voss kept his word. The boy, now a staff sergeant, sent me a Christmas card every December with nothing inside but his handwritten name. Tomorrow night, in Charlotte, that decade was finally going to come due. The cookout crowd scattered fast after that, the way people do when they don't know how to process what they just watched. My mother went inside without a word. Aunt Pam stood in her doorway, caught Doc's eye, and gave him a nod that didn't need translating. I was pulling my keys out of my pocket when Doc fell into step beside me, walking the way one soldier walks beside another, not asking permission, just matching pace. You don't have to say anything, he said. I just need you to know one thing. He held the envelope out toward me. Worn soft, taped twice, opened and resealed more times than paper should reasonably survive. I asked him why he kept it. Because when that helicopter came down out of the storm, he said, I thought I was looking at something that shouldn't have been possible. Afterward, sitting in the field hospital, I kept thinking, does anybody in the world know what she just did? He paused. The answer was no. So I decided at least one person should hold proof that it happened. Something tightened behind my sternum, not sadness, recognition. While my mother was telling relatives, I'd disgraced the family name. While my ex-husband was overnighting legal paperwork. While the papers were running Voss's version of the story, a stranger had been quietly cutting clippings out of newsprint and keeping a record nobody else had bothered to keep. I sat in the truck a long time before I called General Voss, my Voss, the real one, and told him I was coming to Charlotte. I was reaching for the door handle when my mother appeared from the side of the house, faster than I expected, carrying a plate of leftover deviled eggs wrapped tight in foil. Her oldest move, the one she pulled out when logic failed and denial wasn't landing. Quinn, have you eaten? Let me send some of this with you. I looked at the plate, the same recipe she made every year for my sister's birthday, never once for mine. And here it was, offered at 10 at night in a driveway, by hands that had never once reached for me without an angle attached. No, thank you, I said, voice flat as a kitchen table. She didn't move. Leaving would mean admitting food hadn't fixed it. Doc exaggerates, she said, sliding into that patient, explaining things to a child tone. Those old veterans, you know how they get with their stories. I'm not saying you're lying, I'm just saying it was a long time ago. Memory plays tricks. My sister appeared behind her, phone in hand but eyes nowhere near the screen, a pose clearly rehearsed to look accidental. Are you actually okay, Quinn? Like, really? We worry about you. Always off on your own, no real support system. I just don't understand the military stuff. I'm sorry, I'm just a worried sister. The real message underneath all that concern was simple. Your career means nothing here. What matters is staying small enough to fit back inside this house, under our terms. I put my hand flat on the truck door. I'm not doing this tonight, not because I don't have anything to say. Because what I need to say isn't for tonight. My mother opened her mouth. I kept going before she could get a word out. Doc isn't exaggerating, and I'm not unstable. But you're not going to understand that tonight either. I got in, started the engine, didn't check the mirror. 1 in the morning, kitchen table, the only light in the house coming from a desk lamp. My grandmother's Bible, spine soft from decades of being open to the same page, sat there waiting. I didn't need to read the verse. I knew it by heart. But that night I needed to see the words instead of just carrying them. Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? In the months after that sandstorm, this verse had kept me on the breathing side of a very thin line. Tonight it carried different weight. Not about a battlefield, about a ballroom in Charlotte where a coward was about to accept an award bought with the blood of men he'd left behind. I pressed my palm flat against the page. Here I am, send me. I walked back to the closet and pulled out my dress blues, wrapped in a garment bag I hadn't opened in 3 years. Laid each piece across the bed, distinguished flying cross, air medal, wings stitched onto the sleeve. Every decoration, a chapter of a life my mother had never once cracked open. I closed my eyes for 4 hours, same protocol I'd run before every mission that mattered, and woke at 5 without an alarm. The Sheraton Ballroom in Charlotte had chandeliers throwing soft gold light across the marble, a red carpet running from the entrance straight to the head table, dark suits, polished shoes, the smell of good wine and better cologne, the atmosphere of people who'd never had to breathe in anything that actually burned. Doc walked in beside me. I wore the dress blues not for show, but because it was the only language everyone in that room understood fluently. The second someone caught the eagles on my shoulder, they stopped mid-sentence, not out of surprise that a woman was wearing them, but because they understood exactly what those insignia cost to earn. General Voss, the one I was there for, stood at the center of a cluster of donors, silver hair combed back, wearing the comfortable ease of a man who'd been honored so many times he'd mistaken the costume for the character. His gaze caught my dress blues from across the room, and the color started draining out of his face the way it does when blood drops to your feet. He clocked the rank first, eagles that take 20 years of clean service to earn, then the ribbons, which any career officer can read by weight and rarity. And finally, behind all the brass and the posture, he found the face he'd spent a decade trying to erase from every official record in the Department of Defense. He came to my table before the program even started. "Colonel," he said, extending a hand, projecting warmth like a stage light. "You look well." I let the silence stretch 3 full seconds, well enough to remember every detail of that October general. His hand dropped. The smile didn't come back. The MC introduced him with a recitation of decisive leadership, unwavering commitment to those who serve. I sat with my spine like a steel rod, eyes locked, not blinking. His fingers gripped the podium a little tighter with every pass his eyes made over my table. "Sadly," he said, voice sliding into rehearsed sorrow, "some who've served couldn't overcome their own psychological strain. They construct myths to mask poor discipline. Insubordination gets repackaged as heroism. But those of us who were actually there, we know the difference." He looked dead at my table when he said it. A chair scraped against the marble. Doc stood, one hand on the chair back for balance, shoulders square like 61 years, and 2 knee replacements had never happened. I was there. 4 words, no microphone, didn't need one. Every head in the room turned. "This woman flew into a sandstorm while you sat in a command tent, signing an order to abandon 7 men. I saw your signature on that withdrawal order with my own eyes." The murmur that went through the crowd wasn't quiet. It was 200 people recalculating everything they thought they knew. A Marine in a wheelchair, missing his right leg below the knee, braced on the armrest and pushed himself upright, slow, fighting gravity in front of the whole room and winning. I was on the ground that night. Colonel carried me onto that aircraft herself. I heard the first round hit while I was still in her arms. She didn't stop running. A combat medic stood next. I treated 3 of the men she brought back. No extraction order was ever issued from command. 1 helicopter flew into that storm, hers. Then the boy, a staff sergeant now, broad-shouldered, in a dress uniform, a face I hadn't seen in 10 years but recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting, stood up, didn't make a speech. 6 words, voice cracking on the last one. "Ma'am didn't leave me behind." General Voss backed away from the podium, hands white-knuckled on the edge, watching his entire legacy disintegrate in real time in front of 300 people. My second Voss, my Voss, rose from the front row without any hurry. The hall went dead silent the second they registered his stars. "The combat records from that operation were declassified last month," he said, voice carrying to every wall without a microphone, "including the signed withdrawal order, the after-action report, and the internal investigation that sat buried for a decade. The record's been corrected." The Marine in the wheelchair raised his hand to his brow in a slow salute. Then the boy, then Doc, then row by row, the entire hall rose to its feet in total silence. Nobody clapped, just reverence for a truth that had finally been spoken out loud. From the edge of my vision, I saw my mother standing near the back entrance, sliding down the wall, hand pressed over her mouth, crying. She'd seen all of it, every clipping, every witness, every salute. 3 days later, 10 in the morning, 3 soft knocks on my front door. I checked the peephole. My mother stood on the step, stripped of the makeup and the armor, holding a tin of homemade cookies, the exact recipe she'd only ever baked for my sister. "I'm sorry," she said, voice cracking on the first word. "I didn't know." "You didn't know," I said, "or you chose not to find out. You had my number every single year. You never once dialed it." She reached for my arm. I stepped back 1 pace. "You don't need a chance to understand me," I told her. "You need a chance to feel better about yourself. Those aren't the same thing. Please go home," I said, "and don't come back." I closed the door. The deadbolt turned dry and final, the shortest, most decisive sound in this whole story. That same week, General Voss asked to meet me at a diner off the interstate, vinyl booths, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during a previous administration, no medals, no aid waiting in the car. Just a 70-year-old man across a sticky table from the woman he'd tried to bury. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" he asked, the only question he had left. "Because hatred is dead weight," I told him. "I used those 10 years to get stronger instead." Every soldier I brought home after that happened, because I refused to let you be the whole story of my life. I left cash on the table and walked out into daylight without looking back. 1 week after Charlotte, Doc called. Not about General Voss, not about my mother. Just a quiet ask. He ran a small support group on Wednesdays out of a community center in Boone, coffee and folding chairs, veterans who needed somewhere to sit that wasn't alone. I drove out in jeans and a ball cap, the disguise that never fully comes off. A young soldier in the corner sat curled forward, eyes on the floor, shoulders pulled in tight like he was trying to take up less space than gravity required. I recognized the posture before I recognized anything else about him. It was mine, 10 years younger. When the facilitator turned the floor to me, I stood without notes. "The worst part isn't the front line," I told the room. "It's coming home and convincing yourself that isolation is the thing as safety. It isn't. It's a trap wearing safety's clothes." The young soldier looked up. "Why do they call you Reaper? Doesn't that mean death?" I smiled, the real kind, not the kind I'd learned to perform in command. "Reaper goes into the dark to bring people back," I told him. "No matter how deep they've fallen. That's the only part of the name that ever mattered to me." Driving home that night with the windows down, warm air pushing against my face, I thought about my mother sitting alone in that house with the family photo still hanging where I wasn't quite in frame. I thought about General Voss carrying the weight of 300 witnesses for the rest of his life. I thought about my sister, still somewhere out there drafting a text that would somehow make this my fault. All of them were locked inside something of their own making. I'd walked through every version of that storm, the sand, the charges, the phone call that ended without goodbye, and I'd carried myself out the other side, not because anyone rescued me, because I decided every single day for 10 years that I was worth the walk back. The quiet in that truck wasn't loneliness anymore. It was the silence that settles in after the last round's been fired, when the dust finally clears and you realize you're still standing. Not at the edge of somebody else's photograph, but finally, fully, home to myself.